Welcome to Reinventing Democracy. And in this episode, I have great fortune to have Manuel Arriaga with us today. And Manuel is a visiting research professor at New York University. And he's also written a very interesting book on reinventing politics it's this book here, if you can see that, Rebooting Democracy. Welcome, Manuel.
Hi, Andy. Thank you very much.
In this book, basically, you are presenting some of the problems that we're facing today with representative democracy. And in the first few chapters, you're showing how there are, I guess, two main problems with the system we have right now, which is that that in general, citizens, we have delegated power to a political class, a political elite. And secondly, that as voters, we've been condemned to, we don't reflect properly on how we vote, and it's very easy for the politicians to influence our decisions and to manipulate us. So maybe just in general, could you just talk through those two aspects and a little bit about how you see those problems today and what they are? Yeah.
And certainly, although I will have a hard time summarizing them
Exactly,
better than you did, but the first of this, as you pointed out, is that I believe we have, over the last few decades at least, developed an excessive faith in the virtue of delegation, of delegating decision-making to someone whom we believe has got the right incentives, the right mindset, and the right profile to represent our best interests. And when I speak of this collective we, I am referring to we as the public, we as the citizenry of some nominally democratic societies such as the ones we currently live in. And I'm particularly skeptical of this notion because I believe that as has become increasingly clear to many folks, especially in recent times, there is quite some difficulty in ensuring that this mechanism of seeking re-election, this mechanism has got quite a hard time in ensuring that whomever we put in office, whomever we elect into a position of power, will in fact be particularly interested and motivated to pursue the public interest. The reasons why this happens can be multiple, but at its core, I believe the main point is that the political class, just as you pointed out, is quite an insular, small, atypical, highly unrepresentative in the demographic sense group. Here in the US, from where I'm holding my side of this conversation, it's well known the amazing number of millionaires who are sitting in Congress, how they are by a huge majority white males, in particular who are particularly affluent, and this obviously is not in and of itself a major barrier to effective political representation. But when you combine it with the very poor incentives for these folks to actually represent the interests of ordinary citizens, plus the power of campaign funds in campaign finance in the US and unfortunately in other countries too, the combination you have is quite explosive. Mm-hmm. The second set of factors that you were pointing at has got to do with the fact that taken individually, any singular voter is easy prey for all kinds of manipulative techniques. Most recently, after the Brexit referendum, you've got discussions about the use of even some sophisticated data mining and profiling technologies for this same purpose. You've got references commonly in the media to the debate about to which extent Cambridge companies such as Cambridge Analytica, perhaps most prominently in the UK, and other similar efforts, to which extent have they been successful or not in really persuading individual voters with highly sophisticated targeted advertising materials online. But this is just a particular broader phenomenon. I'm sharing even on quite an interesting technological topics. And I think we should not mistake this for the broader issue in the sense that voter manipulation, in the sense that we can easily be misled and serve the particular information diet that will combined with our lack of inclination to properly think through topics before casting a ballot. All this together predates the issue of big data and Facebook advertising campaigns. So these two together, on the one hand, the problem with delegating power into a particular political class, and on the other, this issue that we're quite vulnerable to manipulation efforts by sophisticated organizations such as political parties and modern day political campaigns. They represent the bulk of my concerns about how we do politics nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and maybe even if I guess the average citizen may not be able to articulate those difficulties with that, just as you've done, but I think the general public have a sense that that there's something wrong, that they aren't really being represented, and that there is, I think what I've noticed, especially amongst younger people, 40 and below, is that there is a real growing frustration with this system. And I think one of the reasons for me why I've created this YouTube channel is that a lot of people don't know that there could be anything different, this is just the way democracy is. Unfortunately, there's these politicians, that's the way they work, and they've got the game sewn up, and there's nothing we can really do. Your book obviously contests that, and your work is
hopefully that was my goal.
Yes. So, for people who haven't read the book, what solutions exist out there? How can we overcome this situation?
Personally, by far the direction in which I lay most of my hopes and expectations and work these days has got to do with this notion of citizen deliberation. The key idea of voting for representatives that will then arguably represent us over policy in the domain of policy making. We might instead have ordinary citizens, panels of ordinary citizens directly engaging with policy making. Now, I am fully aware of how strange this first sounds. This sounds when you hear it at first. We are very well trained by the society we live in to be scared shitless, I would say, by this notion, in the sense that, what do you mean? Like the folks who were in the bus this afternoon with me, how will they ever be involved in thinking through and giving a half-reasoned judgment or evaluation on different policy options over some complex topic? Now, amazingly, this is not quite the stuff of fantasy. Amazingly, at least for folks, when they first learn about citizen deliberation, this has been put in practice in a variety of places over the world. Just recently, in my native Portugal, we ran a very successful such experiment. Previously, they've been taking place in countries such as Canada, the US, Ireland, most recently in the UK, also in the Netherlands, prominently also in Australia for perhaps 10 years now. So there's a kind of an hidden history of democratic experimentation that most of us don't get to hear about, unfortunately, but which is a reason for immense hope, I would say. And in particular on this topic, that ordinary citizens, these experiments strongly suggest, are perfectly able, if you give them the right conditions, if you create a process and a setting which brings the best of them to the table, not the best citizens, but the best abilities and skills of ordinary citizens to the table, then they will do an excellent job in thinking through different policy options and making a very reasoned, very well-informed decision. So I lay great hope on these kind of projects.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is something that I've been covering in the other interviews as well, and I guess is that also with the things that you've been looking at, is random selection of citizens a part of that?
The one key issue that arises when folks first hear about this notion is, okay, let's admit for a second that you might persuade me that ordinary citizens organized into a group, and if you really give them access to high quality information and you give them sufficient time to think things through, to learn about a topic, to be adequately informed, to deliberate as a group, perhaps you might even throw some expert facilitators in there to help them have a particularly fruitful and equitative discussion. Granted, even if you have these ideal conditions, how would you pick those citizens? How exactly do you get ordinary citizens table? How do you choose them? And I'm very more surprised to hear that these experiments typically involve a sample of citizens chosen at random, in particular a stratified random sample of sorts, through which you basically have a microcosm of the overall society in terms of some key demographic variables, which different folks will define differently. We might speak about gender, age, race, perhaps education, economic status, correlated, and perhaps some other demographic variables that might arguably be thrown in the mix. And once you have defined the profile of the general population in terms of these demographics, then we use a well-established sampling method, which basically gets you a much smaller group, a panel of a few tens or 100 or 200 ordinary citizens that have a demographic profile that is identical to that of the population at large.
You mentioned that there was recently a particular project that took place in your home country of Portugal. Could you tell us a little bit about what happened there and how that was organized?
Certainly. So 3 months ago, we organized in Portugal what we call a citizens forum. It was a pilot. We grouped together 15 Portuguese citizens coming from different parts of the country, different ages, very different professional and educational backgrounds. And they came together over one weekend, just 2 long days, a Saturday and a Sunday, during which they listened to brief lectures and got to question and interview from political scientists to prominent political journalists to members of parliament and former members of parliament, who came together to brief these citizens on the topic of how we might improve the communication between ordinary citizens and the political class. These same 15 ordinary citizens also got to receive recommendations from the general public via an online crowdsourcing competition we organized. And some of the ideas collected via this online crowdsourcing effort were presented to the panel of ordinary citizens, who got to pick a few of them to integrate them into their discussion, together with what they had learned from the invited experts. And over this weekend, these citizens came up with a set of 3 proposals that were later presented to the President of the Portuguese Republic and to the Vice President of the Parliament, as well as to the media, in an effort to basically demonstrate and leave it particularly clear, given that this was the first time this was being carried out in Portugal, that the output of such a process can and will typically be, when things are done right, highly thoughtful and well-developed bunch of ideas, even if Citizens have got, as they had here, a rather reduced time frame to do so. We were just running a pilot, and nonetheless, the output was able to initiate a discussion in Portugal about how we might tackle this growing distance between citizens and their elected officials.
Mm. That's really very interesting indeed. Do you? So you were actually part of conducting this pilot, were you? Were you involved in the initiative?
Yes, well, a group of colleagues and myself are the organizers of this project
Fantastic,
called
yeah.
the Citizens Forum,
Oh,
and we are discussing with different partners, in particular the Portuguese Parliament, as well as one of the branches of government, and the organization of a second deliberative forum of this nature.
so one thing that I'm really interested in this is, a lot of people they want to know, oh, what was the outcome? What was the outcome? And I think in these situations, the outcome is really important and what were the specific proposals. But there's also, for me, a real interest in what were the social dynamics like? How did people enjoy the process? Was it, did
Oh,
people,
yes.
this is, I think, a really interesting aspect of it all. That could you tell me, was there kind of, were friendships formed? What happened?
So, in short, there was this common. The main takeaway, at least for me, from our first attempt at organizing such a deliberative process, is the transformative aspect of it for participants themselves. We would often, and by this I would say very, very often here after that weekend, participants saying, I thought I was signing up for yet another participatory event. But in practice, I came away from here feeling especially empowered and at the same time realizing that folks such as myself can have a voice, and in particular, they are able to come up with, as a group, to come up with highly viable developed ideas. So I think the main notion is one of empowerment here. You over and over again, you realize basically that there is a kind of a transformative experience taking place, even when you just have 2 days to work together. Folks would afterwards say, I'm proud and happy to have been a part of this group. Important, and this is something that emerges from conversations with other practitioners, is that participants must be made to feel from the beginning that their voice will indeed be heard, that there is some kind of commitment for taking into account the output of the process, and that there is a sincere desire to hear what citizens have to say. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of another key element. It was very clear that the participants very keen to point out that we actually were heard, listened to. Our voice was listened.
Very, very interesting. And also in that process was it quite diverse? Were there people from different social backgrounds? I know that some,
Indeed, yes.
Yeah. And how did that work out? Was it difficult to navigate the differences, or did that not pose any problem?
So folks come with very different backgrounds, as you mentioned, to the table. However, with adequate facilitation, care and concern for making sure that the discussion is an equitative one in which all voices can be heard, there are facilitation techniques and approaches that will allow everyone to make their concerns and viewpoints be heard, rather than having the discussion be dominated by a select handful of people who typically will be particularly eloquent and will be particularly at ease expressing their opinions and views, who often have a stronger educational backgrounds. So these common concerns, which are totally valid, can be largely sidestepped through adequate facilitation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this aspect is particularly interesting as well, given the way society now, especially with social media, the algorithms that means that we end up in these bubbles, and that we talk to our friends and we have our ideas reconfirmed, but we rarely get to talk to people on the other, on the other spectrum or the other side of society. And I think this is one really unique. This kind of forum is a unique possibility for that to actually happen. One last question, I guess, is so, I mean, people may realize, okay, there are these innovations now that exist out there. and but there's not that much of it going on at the moment. So what kind of, an individual who's inspired by what they've just heard, what could they actually do to kind of accelerate this process? What kind of things can be done? How can we organize so that this kind of democratic innovation multiplies and increases?
Mm-hmm. And I think it's a great question, and it's one to which I don't know the answer myself, in the sense that there are a number of amazing efforts underway. There are folks in Ireland working in the Irish constitutional conventions. There are folks in the UK organizing citizens' assemblies. Folks in the Netherlands working on the G1000, a variety of ourselves in Portugal, the New Democracy Foundation in Australia, Jefferson Center, and the Healthy Democracy in the US. There's a number of folks doing this kind of work all over the world now. How to come together at an international level for the promotion of this kind of ideas is a big challenge. Upon launching the book, I did create, and I don't mean to pitch this by no means, because as I will
do, that's okay.
I've done no proper use of it whatsoever to date. But I did create a simple website called rebootdemocracy.org, which has got a mailing list, which is precise at its most basic, is precisely aimed at allowing folks basically to say, hey, I would like to be kept abreast of developments in this field, to know what is happening and how I may be a part of it. Admittedly, I've done zero use of this, because of the international activity involving different folks in different countries, by definition, interested in this kind of projects. But I like to think that the resource is there, and I'm delighted to use this mailing list for the sake of promoting whichever international projects might come around. And that need to find, for the time being, still relatively small, but definitely growing international audience of folks who see the appeal and the potential of these kind of solutions, where we basically place ordinary citizens in a position of actually making decisions in an informed and reflective way, as opposed to merely delegating power into the hands of elected officials.
Yeah. I guess what I'm hearing from you there's one element of spreading the word, that people know that that's a possibility. And I think something that's come up for me in just listening to what you've said is also, things like G1000, for example, can be initiated by citizens. So potentially, if somebody feels that the energy and the urge and the inspiration to go ahead and do something like this, there are kind of citizen grassroots initiatives that actually do get the job done as well. So
exactly, and I would just add that even at the local level, for example, there is ample work to be done that can greatly help disseminate and acquaint the general public with these kind of processes. So the kind of initial questions that I mentioned earlier on in our conversation, like when folks first hear about citizen liberation, their disbelief about the potential and basically the smarts of ordinary citizens, and how would they ever be able to thoughtfully engage with policy topics on the one hand, and their concern about how we would actually pick them and what this random selection actually means. Great work can be done in acquainting the general population with these kind of processes at the local level, which requires way fewer resources, and can have just as much, if not a greater impact in showing ordinary citizens that they themselves can be a part of a process of this nature.
Fantastic, yeah. So I suppose one way is if people sign up to your website, then that they'll be connected into that web of growing web. But
I would be delighted to be of assistance. So far, I've been through personal neglect on the one hand, on my part, and on the other, because I'm still looking forward to be contacted by somebody saying, "Hey, I've got a project I want to get started. Could you forward this to folks in my country? Please let me know how I can be of assistance." General. This mailing list is segmented by country, so it should be of some use for folks who are interested in an initiative along the lines you just described.
So, yeah, I mean, it's been a fascinating interview. I'm sure we could go on for a really long time. There's so much in the book itself. There's a lot of detail that I found very interesting myself and new perspectives that I hadn't considered before. So, I encourage people to go ahead and read the book, Rebooting Democracy. But for now, it's been really great to talk to you, Manuel. And
And it was a pleasure.
yeah, I
And thank
personally
you for the great work in getting the word out.
thank you. Yeah. Well, I hope we can connect another time. But for now, thanks very much, Manuel.
Thank you, Andy. All the best.